Have you ever seen a woman who was turned away by the entire town just because of her appearance and a past that hurt her so much that she didn't dare to mention it? And then, amidst all the cold gossip, there was only one little child who held her hand and whispered, "You are so beautiful." In Cedar Bluff, a windy western land, Nora Whitmore is thrust into adversity that seems impossible to escape. A widower stands by her side, a child calls her family, and an entire town demands that she choose leave quietly or face it and keep the fragile happiness that has just begun to bloom. If it were you, would you have the courage to stay in a place that hurt you, or would you turn away even though you know you're leaving behind people who truly need you? Sometimes the hardest choice is the choice to stay true to yourself. If this story touches something deep in your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us on the warm healing journey ahead. The afternoon in Red Willow Valley was as deep as the sigh of a cold land. The temperature hovered around 39 degrees, just enough to create a thin layer of frost on the old wooden planks that lined the dusty Horizon churchyard. The dark pines stood still, motionless, as if waiting for something to happen. And it did. It came in the form of a woman walking slowly into the fading afternoon light. Nora Whitmore appeared in the church doorway. Her old wedding dress clung to her curvaceous frame, heavy but not sloppy. It was the same worn ivory satin that had shone on her wedding day more than 2 decades earlier. Now the seams were worn, the waist pulled, the folds less soft. But Nora wore it. She wore it for one reason. Today was a day to remember the dead of the area. Among them was Ethan Whitmore, her husband, whom she had buried 6 years ago under the cold gravel at the edge of the valley. The murmuring began as soon as Nora took her first step into the 20-yard hallway. Her slightly worn, creamy white boots clicked loudly on the old wooden floor. Everyone in the church, mostly from the town around Red Willow, turned to look. No music, no greeting. Just a stony silence, then a painfully familiar murmur. Someone whispered, "Goodness, what a dress she is wearing." Another voice chimed in, "Who would say she is beautiful?" And then the giggles broke out, spreading like a gust of wind through a meadow. Nora didn't look at anyone. She just kept her neck straight, her deep brown eyes sad but not broken. She walked with a sure step. She weighed almost 240 pounds, but each step she took exuded a calm that most people didn't expect. Inside, her heartbeat slowed. Not from shame, not from fear of being seen, but from the sudden flood of memories. She remembered Ethan's hands on their wedding day, the way he looked into her eyes and said, "It's not your looks, Nora. It's the light inside you that makes me want to marry you," she believed then. Now, when she heard the laughter behind her, she still believed, though that belief had been eroded by each year of widowhood. As Nora approached the front row, the laughter suddenly grew louder. Martha Briggs, the town grocer, famous for her sharp mouth and piercing eyes, sat in the back row. She curled her lips loud enough for Nora to hear and said almost through the air, "Only a child would call her beautiful." That statement made many people bow their heads and laugh. Some also shook their heads, but no one spoke up to defend him. Nora paused, not because she was wavering, but to place a small sunflower on the memorial table. People usually brought roses or lilies or wildflowers, but Ethan always liked sunflowers. He said they were like Nora, always facing the light, no matter how dark her heart was. Nora's hand shook slightly as she set the flower down. Memories of Ethan came flooding back, painful but warm. She stood there for a few seconds, closing her eyes. Then, as if on cue, she turned and walked out. The laughter still followed her like a cold wind against the back of her neck. She tried not to walk any faster, even though she wanted to get away from there. At the door, the cold valley air whipped against her face. Her cheeks burned with shame and unshed tears. Her breath billowed in white clouds. She stood alone in the 3-yard-wide hallway, leaning against an old wooden post, her shoulders slumped. Below the steps were dry yellow sagebrush bushes that trembled in the wind. Nora closed her eyes again. She thought, "Ethan, I just came here to miss you, not to hear those words." Loneliness bites deeply, but she knows she is not easily defeated. 6 years of widowhood have taught her to rise from the hands that do not reach out. A light footstep sounded from behind. Nora opened her eyes. There was a man leaning against a wooden post nearby. He didn't stare at her like the others. He just stood there letting the wind tousle his silver-brown hair from beneath his battered black cowboy hat. His dark brown leather jacket, rough leather gloves, and dark blue scarf draped loosely around his neck all bore the marks of a long-time ranch hand. That's Hank Mercer. The man had lost his wife 10 years earlier. He owned Cedar Bluff Ranch, a little over 3 miles west of the valley. He was so quiet that he wouldn't be heard saying more than a word for months. But everyone knew he was kind, responsible, and though quiet, he was respected. Hank tilted his head slightly toward Nora, his voice low and slow, like each word was carved from stone. "I saw what just happened." Nora was startled. She didn't want anyone to see her weakness, didn't want anyone to see the tears in her eyes. She turned away, trying to keep her voice normal. I just wanted to leave a flower for Ethan." Hank nodded. No questions, no judgment. He pulled an old dark blue cotton handkerchief from his coat pocket, folded it neatly, and handed it to Nora. "No one deserves laughter on a day like this." The words made Nora waver, not because of the comfort, but because of the calmness with which he said them, as if he recognized her pain without needing to examine its cause. Nora hesitated, looked at the handkerchief, then at the man's wrinkled face before her. It was the look of someone who had suffered loss, someone who knew what it was like to feel pain but no longer had the strength to blame anyone. She took the handkerchief and said softly, "Thank you. I'm fine. It's just, they're always like that." Hank didn't say, "Don't mind." He just said, "They laugh because they don't understand." The simplicity of the statement made Nora choke up. It had been years since anyone had said anything about her without pity or sarcasm. Just then, small footsteps ran up the steps. A girl of about 9, with naturally curly blonde hair and a thick, earthy red coat. She gently tugged Hank's sleeve. "Daddy, it's too cold out there." Hank bent down to adjust his daughter's woolen cap. Then he said softly, "June, say hello to Miss Nora." June looked up, her blue eyes wide at Nora. She examined the old wedding dress, then her wind-blown face. There was no fear, no judgment, just curiosity and honesty rarely seen in a child. A smile spread across her little face. She said softly but firmly, "I like your dress, Miss Nora. It's pretty." Nora blinked, just for a second. But that second was enough to shake the wall she had built up inside her. She thought she was too old to hear the word beautiful addressed to her. Yet this child said it as if it were a matter of course. The air was still. The wind seemed to slow down a beat. Nora bowed her head and replied, her voice trembling slightly, "Thank you, June." June's small hand suddenly touched the edge of Nora's skirt, stroking it very lightly. The movement made Nora choke. Someone touched her without hesitation, without avoidance. A warm feeling crept into her chest, as if someone had lit a fire in a place that had long been thought cold. Hank watched the scene. He didn't smile, but there was something deep and quiet in his eyes, as if he had seen something bigger than the whispering. In the distance, the church door closed. A cold wind blew through the courtyard, carrying with it the laughter of the few people still inside. June squeezed Hank's hand. Nora squeezed the handkerchief in her palm, breathing slowly. She knew she didn't belong where the unkind eyes were. But now, on the porch of that old church, with a child calling her beautiful and a man who didn't laugh, Nora felt a little less alone. Just a little. But enough to keep her standing. The late afternoon wind swept along the wooden corridors of dusty Horizon Church, carrying the smell of pine resin and the chill that seeped into every fiber of her being. Below, the old sagebrush bushes drooped in the dew, rustling softly as if sighing. Nora stood there, one hand holding the edge of the handkerchief. Hank had given her the other, lightly clutching the hem of her old skirt. She didn't know whether to leave or linger a moment longer. Part of her wanted to run away from the laughter, and part of her felt strange standing between two people who didn't judge her. June clung to her father's sleeve, her pale blue eyes curious, as if she were seeing something more beautiful than anyone else in the church could see. Hank stood behind her still as a statue, his broad shoulders coated with a thin layer of dust. He hadn't said anything else yet, but the silence made Nora feel heard in a different way. Nora sighed softly. "I didn't mean to make a fuss here." Hank replied slowly and quietly, keeping his eyes on the yard. You didn't do anything wrong." The words, as simple as a grain dropped on the floor, resonated in Nora's heart. She was used to being scrutinized, used to the looks of appreciation, used to the words the women in town would say as she passed. "You look like that and you dare walk into a church in a wedding dress." But now a man of few words like Hank said them as lightly as a breath. No loud defense, no soothing words, just the truth. June sat down on the steps, her little legs swinging, her red woolen hat slightly tilted to one side. She looked at Nora, her voice small but clear. "Are you here to remember Uncle Ethan?" Nora nodded. "Yes. Today is Memorial Day. He was a very good man." June tilted her head, asking innocently, "Good, like Daddy?" Hank cleared his throat. "June, don't compare." "But I'm telling the truth," June replied, her eyes sparkling. "I think she's sad, like Daddy is sad every time he stands on the porch." Nora paused, her heart clenched at the truth of the words. She looked at Hank and saw that he was silent, his eyes downcast, as if to hide something that had just been touched. "Children always tell the truth." Nora laughed softly, squeezing her handkerchief. "Maybe. We've all lost someone important." Hank didn't deny it. He just took a deep breath, his eyes filled with the weariness of someone who'd lived with emptiness for years. After a while, Hank said, "It's cold out there. Do you want to go home now? I have a pickup parked across the lot." Nora shook her head. "I can walk. My house is only half a mile away." "That road is slippery," Hank said. "It can be icy near the stream." Nora smiled weakly. "I'm used to it. There's no road in this valley I haven't been on." She said so, but her eyes were tired. Suddenly Hank asked Nora, "Why did you wear that dress? Sorry if it's a little personal." She looked down at the hem of her dress, smoothing the worn folds. "Because I had nothing else to remind me that I was loved," Nora said softly, her voice as soft as ashes after a fire. "On our wedding day, he looked at me as if I were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen." A breeze blew through, making Nora's dress flutter. "And I was afraid. If I didn't wear it today, that memory would be buried with the years." June stood up, gently approached Nora, and placed her small hand on the back of her hand. "I think Uncle Ethan still thinks you're beautiful." That made Nora swallow back her tears. She bowed her head and replied, "Thank you, June." A young couple emerged from the church doors, glanced at Nora, and exchanged a questioning look. Martha Briggs followed, her scarf pulled tight around her neck, her voice deliberately loud enough for Hank and his father to hear. Some people should know their place and not be made a laughingstock on Memorial Day. Hank turned, his eyes cold. "Martha, that's enough." "Oh, I'm just telling the truth," Martha shrugged. "Everyone thinks that." Nora bit her lip. She was used to the attack, but it still stung. She tilted her head, intending to hurry down the steps to avoid the disturbance, but Hank said, his voice low and hard, "Just because they think that doesn't mean it's right." Nora paused. Martha rolled her eyes and walked away with a disdainful shrug. The wind blew through the wooden hallway again, leaving a long silence. Nora was at a loss for words. Hank's words weren't loud, but they were more powerful than any shout. June tugged on Nora's hand. "Do you want to come to the ranch with us? It's much warmer there." "June," Hank reminded her. "I just don't want her to be sad," she replied, her eyes sparkling. Nora looked down at June, her curly hair the color of the afternoon sun hitting her cheeks. "Thanks, but I don't want to bother you." Hank took a step closer, not too close and not too far. "No, it's not a bother. It's just, sometimes it's hard to walk home alone after a day like this." His voice wasn't pressing, just suggestive. But the kindness made Nora look him in the eye for the first time that afternoon. In Hank's dark brown eyes, Nora saw something she hadn't seen in anyone in a long time, understanding that needed no explanation. A long moment passed. The wind blew through the planks, the wood groaning softly under the pressure of time. Nora tightened her grip on the scarf Hank handed her. "Maybe I should take a walk," Nora said softly. "To clear my head." Hank nodded. "If you change your mind, I'll be here in a few minutes." Nora stepped down the steps, her boots making a low clicking sound. June ran a few steps after her, then stopped, waving Miss Nora. "You're really beautiful." Nora stopped in the middle of the stone path leading down into the valley. She didn't turn around immediately. She took a deep breath, letting the words sink in like the thin sunlight at the end of the day. When Nora turned back to look, Hank was still standing on the porch, June standing beside him, father and son, a small point of light in the cold silence of Red Willow Valley. Something very small, very thin but very real lit up inside Nora. A feeling she thought she had left behind years ago, the feeling of being seen. She walked, slowly, but not as heavily as when she had entered the church. The rest of the way was half a mile, but to Nora this afternoon seemed less long. The next morning, Red Willow Valley awoke to a pale light filtering through the gray clouds. There was no bright sunshine, just a soft, breathing light that bathed the wooden fences, the small roofs, and the dirt road that ran through town. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles from the distant hillsides, drifting between the houses with their peeling paint. Nora Whitmore leaned against the windowsill of her small house. An old wooden house just over 400 square feet, enough for one person to live quietly. She looked out at the street ahead. A few pickup trucks passed by, leaving behind dust and wind. A few townspeople on early morning walks, passing each other like familiar shadows, but unfamiliar to her feelings. Last night Nora thought she wouldn't sleep, but somehow every time she closed her eyes, she remembered June's eyes, the way she'd looked at her old dress, like it was something cute, not something to be mocked. And Hank's eyes, calm, uncompromising, uncritical. Those images were like quiet spots of light shining into a dark corner of her heart. Though small, they were enough to push the heaviness out into the night sky. Nora gently squeezed the hot cup of tea in her hand. The steam rose to the rim of the cup, creating a mist. She said to herself, "Today, I will not let yesterday's words tire me anymore." But that lucidity only lasted until Nora went to the grocery store to buy some flour and some bacon. She pushed open the door, the jingle echoing in the familiar wooden space. And as usual, Martha Briggs was behind the counter. Martha glanced over her eyes as hard as if frozen from the winter. "Oh," she said sourly, "you had the nerve to go out this morning, Nora." Nora didn't reply. She just bowed her head, picked up her basket, and walked into the aisle. She was used to that kind of harsh talk. Still, it cut. As Nora reached for the second bag of flour, Martha's voice echoed, "I think, if someone gets laughed at in church, maybe they should take a good look at themselves." Nora paused. She swallowed her pain as she always did. But before she could turn away, the shop door opened. "Hank Mercer enters." He said nothing. He only looked at Martha briefly. Martha immediately fell silent and turned away. Hank went straight to the counter and placed a box of nails and a roll of wire on the table. The light from the porch fell on his stern face, making Martha lower her eyes. Nora wanted to step back to leave the shop immediately. But when she turned, Hank was standing in front of her, just far enough away that it wouldn't be awkward, but far enough away that she couldn't just walk away and pretend she hadn't seen him. "Hello, Nora," Hank said, his voice low and soft. "Hello, sir," Nora replied, trying to keep her composure. He looked down at her basket. "Do you need a ride? I'm going back to Cedar Bluff Ranch." Nora shook her head immediately. I'm used to walking." Hank was silent for a few seconds, then asked very naturally, without forcing or embarrassment, "Are you busy in the next few days?" Nora paused. She was surprised by the suddenness of the question, but his voice was so calm that she didn't feel scared. "I don't have much work." "Why do you ask?" Hank nodded slightly. "My ranch needs someone to help with some light housework, cook a few simple meals, read to the little girl, clean up a bit. The last person just moved out to take care of my sick mother." Nora's eyes widened. She'd never thought anyone would ask her to come to the ranch for anything. Are you sure I'm not good with my hands?" "I'm not." "That's okay," Hank said. "I want someone nice, not someone who's good at everything. And June, she likes you." Nora's heart skipped a beat. "But aren't you afraid of what the townspeople will say?" Hank looked her straight in the eyes, his deep brown eyes unwavering. "Nora, I don't live by what they say." Nora was silent. The words were like a rope pulling her out of her familiar fog of guilt, but a part of her trembled. "I'm afraid I'll mess it up," Nora confessed. Hank spoke slowly, each word sinking into the wooden tabletop. "I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for honesty." Nora bowed her head, her hands clasped together. She thought of the small house, the silent evenings, when no one spoke, the bed larger than it needed to be, and the days after days when no one called her name. At Cedar Bluff Ranch, at least there was June. There was the laughter of children. There was Hank's kind eyes. A place without the whispers of Martha and her kind. But Nora still couldn't nod right away. She just asked, softly, as if afraid the answer would hurt her more. "You hired me. Out of pity, right?" Hank frowned, not displeased but more serious. "I don't pity anyone, Nora. I just see things other people don't see." He continued, his voice steady as a stream running over stone. "You went to church yesterday. You knew exactly what they were going to say. And yet you walked in with your back straight. People like that are not weak." Nora's eyes stung. She turned to catch her breath. She wasn't used to hearing such words. They confused her more than they pleased her. Finally she let out a soft sigh. "If you really think I can help, I'll try." A small smile crossed Hank's lips, a rare one. "Good. I'll stop by your house this afternoon. The ranch road's a little rough. I'll give you a ride." June had been standing behind her father for some time. She jumped up and said loudly, "Yay, Miss Nora is really coming to my house." Nora laughed softly, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. "Yes, she will." As Nora left the grocery store, she walked more slowly than usual. The ground beneath her feet felt lighter and wider. As if the half-mile home were no longer a lonely path, something was opening up. Not too clearly, not too quickly, but enough for Nora's broken heart to begin to breathe more deeply. That afternoon, when Hank's silver pickup pulled up in front of the house, Nora stood on the porch and looked down. She had packed a small bag, not much, just a few cotton clothes, an old book, and her wedding silk scarf. When Hank opened the car door, he said simply, "Ready, Nora," just nodded. And for the first time in years, she took a trip not to escape sadness, but to go toward something warmer. Hank Mercer's silver-gray pickup rolled slowly up the dirt road leading into Cedar Bluff Ranch. The road was a gentle slope about 12 feet wide and wound between two old wooden fences. The ground was streaked with mud from the rains of 3 days before. On either side of it was a stretch of prairie grass that stretched to the horizon, where red brick cliffs stood still like old Western soldiers. Nora sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting on her small duffel bag. She looked out the window, watching the sagebrush brush pass by. The wind blew through the crack in the window, bringing in the smell of damp earth and dry grass, reminding Nora of trips she and her husband took when they were young. Ethan drove, and she told stories along the way. Now the memory returned as gently as chalk dust on an old book. Hank said nothing the whole way. He was the kind of man for whom silence was a faithful companion. But his silence was not heavy. It was like the steady breathing of the prairie, not disturbing, just calming. June sat in the back, hugging her little brown teddy bear tightly. She tilted her head to look at Nora the whole way, sometimes smiling, sometimes touching her finger to the glass to draw faint circles. Nora felt the gentle warmth, and a feeling like a new breath of air rose in her heart. When the car pulled up in front of the ranch's main house, Nora was surprised. The log cabin was larger than she'd expected. The cedar walls had faded to gray-brown with age, and a 6-foot porch provided shade from the sun and wind. A wooden swing hung from one side of the porch, the rope worn but sturdy. A few small potted cacti by the door looked as if someone tended them with quiet patience. "Welcome to Cedar Bluff," Hank said as he got out of the car. June jumped down and pulled Nora's hand. "I'll take you inside." Nora smiled a little shyly but let the child lead her over the wooden steps. She stepped into the house, where the smell of pine hung in the air, mixed with the faint scent of toasted cornbread. The wood floors were polished with age, and the living room was about 200 square feet, with a few armchairs covered in faded fabric. "You can have the room on the right," Hank said, pointing to a door near the stairs. "It's small but quiet." Nora opened the door. It was a neat room with a single wooden bed, blue-checked sheets, and a window that looked out onto a distant fence where horses grazed. She squeezed the strap of her bag. "Thank you, Hank. I appreciate it." Hank just nodded and went out to bring some firewood into the house. June hurriedly placed the teddy bear on Nora's bed, as if it were a special welcome. The first thing Nora did that day was help with dinner. She stood in front of the ranch's old gas stove trying to reheat the stew Hank had made at lunch. But being a habitual cook, Nora accidentally turned the heat up too high, causing the pot to boil over and overflow. Nora panicked and turned off the fire, wiping it away with a towel. Oh no, not again. She heard footsteps behind her. Hank stood there with a hatchet covered in splinters. It's all right, he said. This stove is tricky to control. Nora smiled wryly. I'm not good at controlling anything either. You're good at keeping your cool, Hank replied. That's not something everyone can do. Nora didn't know how to respond. Hank's calmness was like a warm, woolen blanket over her confusion. In the afternoon, June asked Nora to read to her. They sat on the rocking chair in the living room. Nora read slowly, her voice even and warm. June rested her head on Nora's arm, listening attentively to every word. Hank sat outside, adjusting the saddle, an unfinished job. He didn't look much, but with each sentence Nora read, his face relaxed slightly like a sigh. When June reached her favorite part, she raised her head and whispered, "You read it like my mom did." Nora paused. Hank paused too. For a few seconds the three of them stood still in the thin light from the window. The words softened the room. Nora put her hand on June's hair, stroking it gently. "Thank you. I'm honored to hear that." Hank closed his eyes for a beat. When he opened them again, his gaze was softer, more subdued. But he said nothing. He just continued to tighten the leather strap as if to steady himself. The next day, Nora helps Hank hang out the blankets and clean out the storage room. She bumps into a wooden shelf, causing a box to fall to the ground and pop open, revealing June's old toys. Nora quickly bent down to pick it up, but her fumbling hands dropped a few more. "I'm sorry. I'm clumsy." Hank stepped forward and bent down to pick it up too. "Nora, who doesn't drop things? I drop a lot." Hank curled his lips. "Then I pick up a lot. That's all." They both looked at each other, then laughed very lightly. The laugh was not loud, but genuine. At noon, Nora followed June to the stables. She pointed to the shiny black horse, "My name is Whiskey." Then to the gray-brown one, "And this is Dusty. He's a little fussy." Nora smiled. "He looks like someone I used to know." "Like Uncle Hank," Nora laughed. June continued, "But Uncle Hank isn't mean to you. I can see that." The suddenness of the words left Nora speechless. She looked out at the field, wide, empty and gray-green, to hide her confusion. That evening Nora resolved to make a proper dinner, to make up for the stew that had overflowed the night before. She cooked the stew in a 1-gallon cast-iron pot, simmering it for over an hour. The aroma was so strong that June could smell it from across the room. But when she brought the pot out to put on the table, Nora's hand was shaking slightly and she accidentally dropped the iron ladle, causing the sauce to splash onto the tablecloth. "Oh no," Nora gasped. Hank walked over and looked at the little spot of sauce. "This isn't your fault." Nora frowned. "It's my fault." Hank replied, "No, it's just a drop of sauce on the wooden table. I've lived here for 20 years. Calves run through the kitchen. This drop of sauce isn't worth getting upset about." June interjected, taking Nora's hand. "I like this dinner. Don't be afraid." Nora looked at the father and daughter. A man of few words but with a kind heart, and a girl as innocent as a small flower. Nora's heart softened. "I just don't want to bother anyone," Nora said honestly. Hank looked at her calmly. "Nora, you're not here to worry about being a bother. You're here because we want you here." That sentence, simple but like a string holding Nora's heart after many years of being abandoned. That night, when Nora returned to her room, she found a neatly folded towel on the small table. On top of it was a small caramel candy bar. There was no name, no note, but Nora knew who had left it. Nora touched the candy bar, feeling something hard to describe. Something warm and light, and the first she had felt in a long time. Maybe Cedar Bluff Ranch wasn't just a place she came to work. It was a place where she was starting to see herself again. Mornings at Cedar Bluff Ranch always began with the sound of the wind sweeping across the prairie. 30-plus acres of land stretched out, reaching to the red rock hills beyond like a vast shawl covering the valley. The sky was grayer than usual that day, but there was no sign of rain, just wind. The wind cut through the 2-foot-tall grasses, creating a familiar hoarse sound like the sigh of the earth. Nora walked out onto the front porch, clutching her light brown wool coat. She saw Hank tying the saddle to Whiskey, the black horse. He worked with absolute concentration, each movement neat and sure, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. June ran around the yard, her little rubber boots clicking on the dirt. Nora smiled softly as she watched June chase the scurrying hens. "Slow down," Nora called. June turned her smile so bright it eclipsed the gloom. "I just want to see who's the fastest." Nora laughed, but before she could say anything more, a loud noise from the field stopped her. A long, high-pitched, excited neigh. She turned her head to look toward the far fence. 3 wild horses stood in the open field. The largest was silver-gray in color, its long mane waving in the wind. It was a Mustang, a weather-beaten breed, unpredictable and powerful. Another was circling, stomping its hooves as if to signal that something was amiss. Nora glanced at June, who was still running oblivious to the danger at hand. June was only about 40 yards from the horses. Very close. Close enough to cause trouble if the horses spooked. Nora looked around. "Where is Hank?" She found him behind the barn, his back to the pasture. He didn't see June getting too close to the Mustangs. For a moment, no one said anything, no call came out. But Nora's heart suddenly pounded in her chest as if someone were tugging at it. June was getting closer, running in the direction of a falling ball. Wild horses instinctively react to fast-moving objects. And then it happened. The gray Mustang suddenly reared up its ears, flattened its hooves, pounding the ground, kicking up dust. It spun its shoulders hunched, ready to charge in the direction of the movement, the direction June was running. Nora didn't think. There was no time to consider. There was no second to be afraid. She just ran. Nora's long, tightly tied hair flew free from its binding as she sprinted. Her wool skirt clung to her legs and her boots hit the ground with a solid thumping sound. Despite her nearly 240 pounds, she had never run faster. The wind whipped in her face. Rocks bounced underfoot. Everything collapsed into a single straight line. "June! June! Stop!" Nora shouted, her voice carrying on the wind. June stopped and turned her eyes wide with horror as she saw the horse charging at her. Nora's heart pounded with every step, feeling as if it were about to burst from her chest. The distance between her and the child closed in an instant. The horse charged. Nora charged too. "Get down, June," Nora shouted. At the last moment, Nora wrapped June in her arms, turning so that her back was exposed. The horse passed them, its hooves scraping the ground, kicking up rocks and hot wind into Nora's face. The two fell to the hard ground. Nora held the baby tightly, her heart pounding uncontrollably, her breathing ragged. It all happened in seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. The sound of hurried footsteps came from behind. Hank came rushing in like a gust of wind. He dropped his glove and knelt beside them. "June, Nora." His voice broke something Nora had never heard before. Nora opened her eyes, still holding the baby tightly. June was shaking her breath, coming in small gasps. "She's okay. I think she's okay," Nora gasped. Hank put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and pulled June into his arms, his hands shaking visibly. "Daddy! Daddy!" June gasped, clinging to him as if afraid he would disappear. When he was sure June was unharmed, Hank turned to Nora. His eyes were no longer the calm, familiar ones. They were deeper, more frightened, more painful, as if he had just seen something he never wanted to see. "Nora, are you hurt?" he asked slowly, but his voice was broken. Nora shook her head despite the slight pain in her arm and back. "I'm fine. She's fine." Hank looked at her for so long that Nora had to look away, finding his eyes so sincere. "Nora, you didn't hesitate for a second," he said softly. "The baby's out there," Nora whispered. "I just couldn't think of anything else." Hank squeezed Nora's shoulder lightly, not hard, but enough for her to feel the gratitude simmering in it. "I owe you something. Big." Nora shook her head. "I didn't do anything big." Hank said something Nora didn't expect. "Not everyone has the guts to run into the path of a panicked Mustang. I saw that. I couldn't run fast enough. But you could." June still held Hank tightly, her small hands shaking. He bent down, stroked her head, and spoke slowly and firmly. "June, you're safe today thanks to Miss Nora. Thanks to her daddy didn't lose anyone else." Nora looked up. The remark struck her harder than any compliment. She had considered herself a burden. She had feared that even her presence would bother others. Yet today, Hank said she had saved his little world, his only child. The morning wind blew across the meadow again, cold but real. And a strange feeling arose in Nora, not pride, not vanity, but a feeling of worth. Value does not come from looks. It does not come from rumors. It does not come from looks in church yesterday, but from the moment of reaching out to protect a child without thinking about danger. As Hank led Nora toward the porch, he said something Nora would remember for a long time. "You are stronger than you think. And I see it." Nora didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to back away to defend herself, to tell herself he was being nice. But another part, the part that had been buried deep, was beginning to crackle. Just a small ray, but enough to ignite something close to hope. Late afternoons at Cedar Bluff Ranch are always beautiful. As the sun begins to dip behind the red rocks, orange light touches every blade of grass, every board on the fence, and even Nora's brown hair as she stands on the porch hanging out some towels to dry. The air is so still you can hear the wind through the wood. It had been 2 days since June's near accident. But for Nora, the moment was still fresh in her mind. Every time she saw June running around the yard, healthy and chirping, she felt a lump in her throat. Partly from relief, partly from fear. If she had been just a little slower that day, things would have been different. But June was as innocent as if nothing had happened. She always ran to drag Nora out into the yard to see the hens, or invited Nora to chase the dry leaves blowing in the wind. She always smiled and said, "Miss Nora, look, this looks like a little mouse," or "Miss Nora, I hear a deer." Her innocence was like a ray of sunshine on a winter day. Weak, but warming Nora's heart. Hank was different too. Not a drastic change, but a subtle one. He took his eyes off June less often than usual. He glanced at Nora often as if to make sure she was okay. There was no longer the wary distance from the first day. His voice, though still quiet, was warmer, less dry. That afternoon, Nora was folding her blankets by the fence when Hank walked by holding a newly repaired bridle. "Does your arm still hurt?" he asked slowly. "It's better," Nora said, smiling slightly. It was worth the pain to keep June safe. Hank paused. "Don't say that. Whether it was worth it is up to me, not you." Nora was taken aback by the statement. It was simple, but it carried a care she had grown accustomed to lacking for years. Hank frowned slightly as if considering something. "Nora, I was really scared that day." Nora bent down to fold the blanket away from his eyes. "I know. I was scared too." Then she added, her voice soft as a confession, "I don't want to lose June. And I don't want to see you hurt because of her." Hank was silent. But his silence was not evasive. It was the silence of a man thinking of something deeper, something larger. The silence of a man who understands the value of life and of the people he still loves. "Thank you," he said finally, very simply but more resonant than any flowery words. In the evening, Nora cooked a roast pork in a cast-iron pan and heated up some cornbread. June sat at the table, drawing with a pencil, her feet dangling, her face dirty but radiant. As Nora placed the plate of cake on the table, June looked up and said, "Miss Nora, I drew you." The child held out the paper. It was a clumsy drawing, just simple pencil strokes, a woman in a long dress, her hair tied back, and a smiling child beside her. Nora reached out and touched the paper lightly. "It's beautiful, June, but you drew me much thinner than I am." June grinned, "Because I drew the way I see you. I see you as beautiful, not fat." Nora laughed, but it felt like a quiet pang, not pain but the tapping of something forgotten. Hank came in through the door, his jacket a little dusty. He looked at the drawing, didn't say anything, but his eyes softened visibly. June ran over and pressed the paper into her father's hands. "Daddy, am I pretty?" Hank didn't answer right away. He looked at the paper longer than he should have. Then he folded it gently and put it in his pocket, his voice hoarse but clear. "Yes, pretty." Nora froze at that. Hank had never spoken about her appearance, even in his most tender moments. Though he didn't look directly at Nora when he spoke, the answer made her take a deep breath, trying to calm herself. After dinner, June ran to the backyard to feed the ducks. Nora cleaned up the kitchen, and Hank sharpened his small knife. The yellow light from the oil lamp reflected off his face, highlighting the lines along the bridge of his nose and the corners of his eyes, the marks of a man who had worked for years in the dust of the West. "Are you okay living here?" Hank asked suddenly. Nora looked up, a little confused by the question. "Yes. It's quieter than I thought." "No one bothers you," Nora smiled. "No. If anyone bothers you, it's probably just a few horses that like to whinny this morning." Hank chuckled softly. Softly, but enough to make Nora want to look a little longer. After a long while he put down the knife, propped himself up on his knees and said, "I know your old life wasn't easy." Nora touched her apron, her eyes downcast. "I'm used to isolation. People believe the ugly is more beautiful than the harsh truth." Hank nodded slowly. "Don't let them determine your worth." "I try," Nora said softly. "But being alone for too long, confidence wears thin like an old shirt." Hank looked up, looking straight at Nora. "You're not alone here. You know that." Nora tried to reply, but the words caught in her throat. Not because she didn't believe it, but because she was afraid of believing it too soon. She turned away, pretending to continue washing the pan, while her heart beat faster than usual. Someone had said something small, but she had to keep herself from getting hopeful. Hope easily makes people weak. Hope too soon can easily make people broken again. Night had fallen, bringing a chill through the cracks in the door. When Nora passed Hank's room, she saw the light was still on. He sat at the wooden table reading a small notebook. The handwriting was faded with time. "Is that your wife's diary?" Nora asked softly. Hank didn't flinch. He just closed the book gently. "Yes. I read it sometimes to remember her laughter." Nora stood still for a few seconds. "I'm sorry if it brings up sad things." "No," Hank said. "All pain has a right to rest. But good memories should be left behind." That made Nora bow her head. "You are stronger than I thought." Hank looked at Nora, his eyes so deep and sincere that she held her breath. "I am only strong when I have something worth keeping." In that moment, Nora knew Hank was talking about more than the past. But she didn't dare ask further. Not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she was afraid of hoping for something that wasn't hers. That night, when everyone had gone into the room, Nora lay down on the bed. But instead of being sad for the first time in years, she felt at peace. Not peace from the silence, but from the feeling that there was someone else living with her, breathing the same air, walking the same day. Nora placed her hand on her chest and closed her eyes. Something is starting in this log house. No rush, no fuss, but real. The sky over Red Willow Valley that morning was bluer than usual. A pale blue as thin as the mist on a stream at dawn. Nora stepped out onto the porch, her enameled iron cup in her arms. She sucked in the cool air, letting it flow through her newly combed hair. Something in the air suggested that the day would be longer than usual. Hank was up early. He was checking the north fence the calves had broken through last night, in search of fresh grass. June was arranging her paint box on the kitchen table, humming softly, her voice high like the first bird of the season. Nora prepared a simple breakfast, some bacon toast and a small pot of oatmeal. She was not a great cook, but each day her hands shook less and her confidence returned little by little like the first green leaf after winter. "Miss Nora, are you going to the market today?" June asked, holding the rag doll. "I'm going to buy some dried beans," Nora replied. "We're almost out. I want to come with you." Nora smiled. "I'm staying here with Daddy. It's a long way to town." June frowned but gave in. Hank came in from the yard, dusting his hands on his dusty jeans. "If you want me to take you, I can be free around noon." Nora shook her head quickly. "I can walk. It's fine." Hank looked at her for a long moment, then just nodded as if he knew she needed privacy to breathe and think. The road to Red Willow was nearly a mile long, gently curving along the hillside. Nora walked slowly, clutching her duffel bag. Pickup trucks occasionally passed their tires, kicking up a fine red dust. A few acquaintances saw her, some nodded but most just glanced quickly and looked away. There was always a thin layer of coldness in the way people looked at her, not malicious but enough to make her feel like she didn't belong. But today the air is heavier. Nora entered the grocery store. The jingle sounded again. Martha Briggs, as if programmed, turned to look at her immediately. "Oh, Nora." Martha's voice drawled soft as honey and sharp as a fishbone. "I hear you're moving to Hank's ranch." Nora pursed her lips. "I came to help him with something." Martha raised an eyebrow, a faint smile full of meaning. "Help, or something else?" A few customers who were choosing their items turned to look. The familiar scrutiny. Those eyes were like small knives, not sharp, but if cut repeatedly it would bleed. Nora didn't answer. She walked down the spice aisle, trying to concentrate on the beans she'd come for. but Martha's voice echoed through the room just loud enough. Women like you, the kind of women who leave their hometowns because of trouble, are always looking for somewhere to cling to. A young employee standing nearby glanced at Nora with a hint of pity. But pity hurt Nora more than humiliation. Nora picked up the beanbag and walked up to the counter. "I'd like to pay." Martha crossed her arms. "You know, wealth doesn't matter, but reputation does." Nora kept her voice calm. "I didn't come here to argue with you. So what are you here for? To find a new man to lean on? Hank is too kind. Widowers are often taken advantage of," Nora interrupted. "Stop it, Martha." Martha laughed, a sound like cracking wood. "Oh, Nora Whitmore can raise her voice too." Nora put the money on the counter and said nothing more. But inside she was trembling slightly. Not because she was afraid of Martha, but because she was afraid of believing those things again. Those words had sent her to the bottom of a valley years ago. She walked out of the shop, breathing heavily, and her chest tight. Nora did not know that a few yards away someone else was also listening to the conversation. Hank stood near the post office holding a few unopened letters. He had not meant to eavesdrop, but when he heard Nora's name and Martha's voice, his eyes darkened. He stood there for a few more seconds, then walked toward the path. Nora was walking downhill. Hank caught up with her at the bend where the dirt road met the trail. "Nora." Nora turned a little startled. Why are you here? I heard a little story at the grocery store." Nora bowed her head. She didn't want him to see the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had just lost a thin layer of skin that protected her. "I'm fine," Nora said. "No," Hank replied firmly. "You're not." Nora clutched the beanbag, trying to catch her breath. "It doesn't matter what they say." "Yes," Hank interrupted. "It does. Because they're wrong." Nora in. The wind blew through the space between them. The scent of pine trees from the hills mixed with the scent of the earth drying in the sun. "You're not who Martha described you to be," Hank continued. "You're not what they say you are. You're not someone who needs to cling to anyone to stay grounded." Nora bit her lower lip. "But they always think I am." Hank looked straight at her, his voice low. "They don't mean it's true. You've lived for years with rumors pushing you to the bottom, but I won't let that happen here." Nora didn't know what to say. The words were both strong and gentle. It was like someone had placed a large, warm hand over her heart before it curled up in fear. "At Cedar Bluff Ranch," Hank said slowly, "you're not a stranger. You're one of the family." That made Nora take a deep breath. "You make it sound like I have a place here." "You have room," Hank replied, "if you want." The two walked in silence for a long while. The sun was higher, casting a pale yellow light on the dusty road. Nora slowed down. Aren't you afraid they'll say you had something to do with me?" Hank frowned. "Nora, I buried my wife with my own hands. I lived through the coldest winter of my life. You think I'm afraid of a few whispers?" Nora laughed, a sad, warm laugh. "You always say things that are hard to refute." "I only say the right thing," Hank said simply. Nora looked down at her dusty boots. "I was afraid I was going to ruin our lives." Hank shook his head. "You saved her, Nora. Not just when she was in danger, but after." And then Hank looked off into the distance. June was playing in the ranch yard, just a speck on the vast prairie. "You made her laugh again. She was quieter than you think." Nora felt her chest lighten. Then she sighed. "I don't know if I deserve what you say." Hank replied, "The worthy man is the man who never thinks he is worthy." When they arrived at Cedar Bluff Ranch, June ran out to greet Nora, hugging her leg like a long-lost relative. "What did you buy, Miss Nora?" "Dried beans. I'll cook them for you tonight," June cried out. Hank stood beside her, his eyes still on Nora, as if making sure she was okay. And Nora realized something. Though the world out there is full of rumors, in this wooden house she no longer has to fight alone. A small but deep feeling, like a sprout just breaking through the soil, began to grow inside her. Hope. Cedar Bluff Ranch was quieter than usual that evening. There was a hint of dew in the air and a cool mist crept through the wooden roof. A gentle breeze blew, making a rhythmic sound off the porch boards like the house breathing. Nora had just returned from a trip to town that had been full of words that had left her numb. She told herself she wouldn't let them get to her heart, but they did, silently, like a thorn hidden in the grass. June was sitting on the living room floor, building a tower out of old wooden blocks. She was always creative like this, and Nora loved to see her look of childlike concentration. Every time June looked up and smiled, the whole room seemed to brighten. Miss Nora, June called, still holding a piece of wood to keep it from falling. "Look, I made a house for the ducks. Can I take it to the duck coop tomorrow?" Nora smiled. "Okay. But let Daddy see first." June nodded vigorously, as if it were the law of the universe. Hank came in through the back door, dusting off his hands after checking the last of the fence. The yellow light fell on his face, highlighting the sun-beaten streaks of rancher life, but also revealing a slight weariness at the corners of his eyes. Maybe he'd worried too much about them today, especially after hearing about the grocery store. Hank put his cowboy hat on the shelf, then glanced at Nora before washing his hands. "Would you like some tea tonight?" he asked as he passed the kitchen. "I made some," Nora said. "It's on the stove." Hank nodded slightly, as if that answer itself brought him a sense of familiarity and fulfillment. Dinner that night was simple, just bean stew and some cornbread. But June ate it with relish, and Hank ate his in silence, neither praising nor criticizing, but Nora could tell at a glance that he really enjoyed it. After cleaning up, Nora washed the dishes in the dim light. Hank stood near the sink drying a few plates. Their hands brushed occasionally as they changed the dishes, and each time Nora felt a small warmth creep into the otherwise chilly western evening air. While washing, Nora suddenly asked Hank, "Did I bother you today?" Hank put down his plate. "I wouldn't call it a concern." Nora bowed her head. "I'm bothered that I made you protect." "No," Hank interrupted softly but firmly. "You didn't make me do anything. I did it because I wanted to." Nora was silent for a few seconds. "You always say things that make people feel better." Hank paused, his eyes deep in the lamplight. "Because you needed to hear that soft voice." Nora turned her face away, feeling a strange kind of agitation like the thin vibration of a violin string. "I'm not used to anyone caring like that," Hank replied slowly, each word carrying weight. "You'll get used to it if you stay here long enough." The words took Nora's breath away. It wasn't a clear confession, but it wasn't just a polite remark either. It was a light string tied to her chest, pulling her toward warmth. After June fell asleep, Hank stepped out onto the porch. Nora was already there, wrapped in a woolen scarf, her hands clutching the edges as if to keep the cold out. The moonlight was thin as silver, spreading evenly over the ranch yard and the distant grass. The vastness of the space made every little story today fit, not too big to drown. Nora, not too small to be pushed away. Nora spoke first. "Thank you for letting me stay." Hank clasped his hands together, looking out at the misty fields. "Cedar Bluff isn't a place many people want to live. It's lonely." He paused. "But you don't seem afraid of being alone." Nora chuckled. "I used to be scared. Now, I just wish I had a place where I didn't have to talk to my shadow." Hank turned his eyes so earnest that Nora had to swallow. "You don't have to do that here." Nora looked down at her hands. The scarf was a little frayed at the edges, but it was a favorite. It was like her life, worn but still warm. "Do you think I could be a part of this place?" Nora asked, her voice as light as the night breeze. "You've been a part of it," Hank said. "Since June called you Miss Nora, since you walked into this house with that little smile." A slight heat rose to Nora's cheeks. "You talk as if I have any real value." Hank replied immediately without hesitation. "Nora, you have no idea how much you are worth." The wind blew, forcing Nora to pull her shawl up a little higher. She turned to go inside, but Hank called out softly, "Nora." She turned back. Hank looked at her so long her breath caught in her chest. "There's something I want to say." Nora clenched her hands in her pockets. A small fear crossed her mind. She was afraid he would say something that would suddenly widen the distance between them. "About what happened in town today," Hank said slowly. "You don't have to bear it alone. From now on, if anything like that happens again, you tell me. Hank, I don't want you to get tired because of me." He shook his head, his voice low but strong. "Taking care of the people in the house doesn't tire me." Nora's heart skipped a beat. "Someone in the house?" she asked very softly, as if afraid of breaking something precious. Hank replied without hesitation, "You're here. You help. You save June. You bring laughter back to this house. For me, that's enough to call you family." Nora had to look away, her eyes stinging slightly. She had lived for years feeling like she didn't belong. and yet today Hank had said she belonged in Cedar Bluff, not with flowery words but with the truth he saw. "I don't know how to respond," Nora said softly. Hank stepped a little closer but kept a respectful distance. "Not today. When you're ready." Back in her room, Nora set her bag down beside the bed. The moonlight streaming through the window made the wood look silvery blue. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped together. Martha Briggs's words still echoed like darkness. But Hank's words were stronger, like a small, undimmed lamp. Nora leaned her head against the headboard. For the first time in a long time she felt supported. A place, a cabin, and two people who didn't need her to be perfect to love her presence. Nora whispered softly, as if talking to her heart, "Maybe this place really is healing me." And in the silence of the western night, where the wind blew in layers across the eaves, Nora's heart beat more steadily, more strongly, as if preparing for something bigger, more beautiful that she did not yet dare to name. The weekend morning at Cedar Bluff Ranch began with a thin light draped over the meadows. The wind blew from the west, a sign of a change in weather. Crows swooped down over the fence, cawing hoarsely. The sight made Nora uneasy, though she didn't know why. June was running around the house as usual, hugging her doll, occasionally jumping up and kicking dry leaves. Hank was repairing the wooden gate in the left yard, a corner of which had been knocked down by some calves yesterday. Nora took the basket out onto the porch to dry some freshly laundered towels. But her steps were slower than usual. Her mind was preoccupied with a strange feeling she couldn't name. She took a deep breath, hoping the scent of earth and pine would lighten her mood. "It's supposed to be windy tonight," Hank said from the yard below, hammer in hand. "I think so too." "The air is heavy," Nora said. Hank looked up at the sky, his eyes narrowing. "With this weather, keep June close. She tends to run off." Nora nodded, glancing at the child. "She's quick as a squirrel. I'll keep an eye on her. But one small thing, just one very small thing, is enough to push the whole day toward uncertainty." Nora was busy mixing cake batter in the kitchen. June was painting in the living room. The wind blew hard, making the windows shake. The curtains swayed like blades of grass. Nora realized she had forgotten to pick up the blanket that had been hanging outside to dry. She stepped out to pick it up. It only took a few seconds. When Nora came back in, June was no longer sitting there. "June," no one answered. Nora put down the blanket and walked quickly into the baby's bedroom. It was empty. The back door was ajar. The wind was stronger, whipping the thin layer of dust on the floor into small swirls. Nora knew at once the baby had run outside. She rushed down to the yard. "June," Nora called out. "June, where are you?" There was no reply. Only the wind whistling through the roof and the rattling of the stable door. Nora ran toward the stables. There was no sign of the child. She circled back toward the hill, calling hoarsely, "June, answer me." The wind carried her voice far away, making it unheard. A dark cloud layer rolled in from the west faster than expected. The grass began to sway violently as if a storm were coming. Nora turned toward the lumber yard where Hank was working. "Hank." He looked up immediately when he heard her voice shake. "What's wrong, June? She's not home." Hank dropped his tools and his expression changed. Without a moment's hesitation, he ran straight to Nora. "Which way did you see her go? I only left the room for a few seconds." "The back door was open. I think she went out then." Hank looked around, his eyes quick and sharp, like someone who had often searched for a lost calf in the hills. "Where does June like to go?" he asked. "She runs to the north knoll to see the rabbits." Hank just nodded, not asking more. "You go toward the stables," he said. "I'll go toward the mound. Don't go too far, Nora." Nora nodded vigorously, then ran. The wind blew harder and harder. Dark clouds covered the valley like a cold blanket from the sky. Nora could feel her heart pounding like the sound of hooves on dry ground. The wind cut into her skin and stung her eyes. "June," Nora's voice carried on the wind, then was torn to meaningless pieces by the storm. She walked around the stables, looked at the place where the girl usually played. There was nothing but the tire swing swinging. Nora ran along the west fence. "June, answer me." When she heard nothing, Nora felt a deep, deep fear rise up, the same fear she had felt the day she lost Ethan. The fear of losing someone you love when you no longer have the strength to hold them back. "Please, Nora whispered, her voice choking. "Don't let anything happen to her." She ran until her hips ached, but she didn't stop. The loneliness of the past years seemed to come rushing back, but this time it wasn't loneliness from being left behind, but loneliness from not knowing what to hold on to find June. Suddenly, Nora saw small footprints in the ground, childish footprints sunken but still distinct, leading out towards Cedar Ridge. Nora did not hesitate. She followed the footprints as if she were running after her last breath. On the other side of the hill, Hank walked through the 3-foot-tall grass, a tall shadow in the black wind. His breathing was heavy, his stride wide, his eyes unblinking. But as he walked, he felt the fear in his heart spread like an oil slick. "June," he called out. No answer. Hank hadn't been this scared since his wife died. His daughter was the most important thing left in his life, and now that child was somewhere, in the coming storm. Hank clenched his fists. "Don't let this happen again," he said, as if commanding the heavens. Nora was almost to the top of the hill when the wind blew so hard she had to cover her face. Her woolen skirts clung to her legs, making the climb more difficult. But then right at the top of the rocky hill, under a low juniper bush, Nora saw a small piece of blue cloth, June's shawl. She rushed to pick it up. June. The wind swirled violently, but this time she heard a small sound like a sob. Nora turned her head behind the bush. "June," another hiccup. "Miss Nora," a tiny voice said. Nora collapsed to the ground as if untying a rope around her heart. She rounded the bush and found June huddled against a juniper tree. The wind tousled her hair. Her eyes were red. "I'm lost," June said, her voice shaking like a stretched string. Nora rushed forward, hugging her tightly with both arms. "It's okay. I'm here, June." The wind whipped against Nora's back, but she felt nothing. All she knew was that she was holding the little angel she had almost lost. June cried into Nora's shoulder. "I thought you were angry. I went out to see the rabbits, and then I didn't know my way back." "No one is mad at me," Nora whispered, squeezing her tighter. "No one." Hank appeared at the top of the hill a few minutes later. When he saw the two of them, Nora holding June, he stopped as if his legs wouldn't let him go any further. His eyes, usually calm, were filled with relief and pain. He walked quickly towards them. "Nora, June." His voice seemed to come from the deepest part of his chest. June jumped from Nora's arms to hug her father, and Hank lifted her up, pressing her to his chest as if to blend their breaths. He gently touched her hair, her forehead, and checked for any small scratches. "It's Daddy. You're safe." When he was sure June was unhurt, Hank looked at Nora. His eyes at that moment made the wind stop blowing. "Nora," he said softly, choking. Thank you again." Nora shook her head. "I only looked for her because I couldn't bear it if—" She stopped, her throat tight. Hank understood. He read her fear. He read the attachment she dared not name. Hank put his hand on Nora's shoulder for the first time he had actually touched her. "Nora, you're not just someone who lives in my house. You're someone I trust." Nora bowed her head, her eyes stinging. In the strong wind of Cedar Ridge, three people stood together, not as landlord and servant, not as strangers brought together by circumstance, but like a family that does not dare to call itself a family. After June was found and brought home, Cedar Bluff Ranch breathed a sigh of relief. A strong wind soon followed, rattling the doors and blowing dust into the yard. But inside the cabin, the three people who had just survived a great panic felt each other's presence more clearly than ever. June fell asleep on Hank's shoulder, tears still streaming down her face. Hank carried her into the room, tucking her in carefully as if every movement had to be gentle so as not to wake her. Nora stood in June's doorway, her hands clasped together to steady herself. Her heart was still racing a little too fast, a jolt of fear. But as she watched Hank lean down and place a kiss on her forehead, something else came over her, a responsible warmth, something she had rarely felt in men in her life. Hank stepped out, closing the door softly. When he returned, his gaze lingered on Nora longer than usual. "You're still shaking," he said, his voice low. "I haven't calmed down yet," Nora confessed. "I kept thinking, if I had been a few minutes later—" Hank shook his head, cutting her off in a firm but not hard tone. "But you were on time. That's what matters." Nora took a deep breath, but the worry lingered like the darkness behind the door. June must be scared. Me too, Hank said softly. He said it so frankly without any reserve. It was that honesty that made Nora feel her heart slow down as if comforted by just a few words. While Hank went to check the locks and fences of the stables one last time before dark, Nora sat alone in the kitchen. She poured some hot tea into an enamel cup. The oil lamp cast a golden glow on her hands. Everything seemed to slow down, touching the still smoldering fear. Nora touched the rim of her glass lightly. Why do I care so much? She wondered, not sure the answer was something she was ready to willingly touch. Because since arriving in Cedar Bluff, everything has changed. Not so quickly, but surely. And in that change, there's Hank and June's smile. Nora closed her eyes. Part of her wanted to stay in this warm place forever. Another part was afraid of getting hurt again, afraid of what people would say, gossip, laugh about. She'd seen Hank protect her several times, but could he protect her from the whole town forever? Nora doesn't know. When Hank returned home, he walked slowly to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of tea from the pot Nora had brewed. He leaned against the counter and looked at Nora for a long time. Would you like to go out on the porch and get some air? Hank asked. Nora nodded, not knowing how to refuse his calm demeanor. The two of them went out onto the porch. The wind had died down, but the sky was still cloudy, as if waiting for a light rain. Hank leaned his hands on the wooden railing and Nora hugged her scarf tightly. For a long time, neither of them said anything, just listening to the rustling of the grasslands. Nora finally spoke first. Hank, I'm sorry. Hank turned his head away. For what? For letting June run out? Hank shook his head quickly. It wasn't your fault. But if I'd been more careful... Nora, Hank said, his voice a little harsh, for the first time. Not a scolding, but the certainty of someone who wouldn't let others blame him for nothing. He looked straight at Nora. You saved her twice. Don't make it a burden. Nora bowed her head slightly. I don't want you to think I'm careless. I think you're brave, Hank said, and kind. That's enough. Nora's heart softened, like the soil after a rain. But at that moment there was a very slight noise from behind the door, like the sound of someone's shoes scuffing on the wooden floor. Nora turned her head. Hank turned too. A shadow passed by the kitchen window. Then it vanished as if it had never been there. But Nora knew someone was standing between them, listening. And in this town there was only one person who liked to eavesdrop and then retell with malicious exaggeration, Martha Briggs. Nora's heart clenched. She whispered, Hank, I think someone's listening. He frowned, his eyes sharpening like an old wolf smelling danger. Who? I can't see. But it looks like Martha. Hank sighed, his shoulders tensing. She has no right to come onto this ranch uninvited. Nora put her hand on Hank's arm and shook her head slightly. Don't mess with her. I don't want you getting into trouble because of me. Hank looked at Nora's hand on his. He was silent for a moment, then replied in a low voice, I won't let anyone hurt anyone in my family. The two words, family, echoed again, making Nora squeeze her sleeves to stay calm. That night, Nora could not sleep. She lay awake in her little room overlooking the meadow. The wind had stopped howling, but the uneasiness in her chest remained like a wave that refused to subside. Not because June was lost anymore, but because Martha was there. She would definitely turn the seeing Hank and Nora talking intimately on the porch story into another twisted one. Nora leaned her head against the wooden wall. I don't want things to go wrong. I don't want Hank and June to get hurt because of a rumor. She closed her eyes, her heart struggling between two sides. One side wanted to stay, wanted to keep the warmth she had never had. The other side was afraid of hurting others again. Nora whispered, her voice choking, I'm used to loss, but they aren't. The next morning, Hank woke up earlier than usual. When Nora went down to the kitchen, he was lighting a fire, the light from the stove casting a thoughtful look on his face. Can't sleep? He asked softly. Nora shook her head slightly. And you, same. Silence. A silence stretched between them like a thin string that could snap if the wrong word was said. Finally Hank said, If Martha had really come near my house last night, I would have talked to her. Nora quickly shook her head, her voice almost pleading. Hank, don't. I don't want you to become the subject of gossip because of me. Hank tilted his head, looking deeply at Nora, his gaze as steady and unwavering as a fence driven into the ground. Nora, you don't know yourself well enough. Know what? You're not a burden, Hank said slowly. And you're not a nuisance. Nuisances are people who can't keep their mouths shut. Nora swallowed. But I'm afraid they'll hurt you and June. You don't understand, Hank said. If they hurt me because of you, I can handle it. But if they hurt you, I can't. Nora's heart skipped a beat. She saw clearly this man did not say unnecessary words. Each word seemed to be placed on wood, with all the real weight of emotion. Hank, I don't know if I'd have the courage to stay here if they started speculating more, she said softly. Hank took a step forward, not close enough to make Nora uncomfortable but close enough for her to feel his warmth. When they say, we face, he replied, not run. Nora bowed her head. But I'm used to running. Then this time, you won't be running alone. That sentence was like the first spark after a long night. In that moment Nora knew she was at her most fragile stage, between the past that wanted to pull her back into the darkness, and the future that wanted to lead her into the warm light. All that remains is for a decision. Gossip in Dry Creek never walks. It gallops like a wild horse, charging down the red, dusty roads with enough force to tear apart a family or bury a man under a mountain of whispers. And that morning it called Nora Whitmore. Hank took June to the blacksmith shop as usual every morning to watch Mr. Bill make his little iron horse. Nora hung out some freshly washed robes in the backyard to dry. The wind had died down and the sky was clearer. It felt like everything was returning to peace after the eventful day. But when Hank returned, his expression was no longer calm. He walked into the kitchen, took off his hat and sat down on the wooden table and was silent for a long time. Nora recognized him at once. "What's wrong, Hank?" Hank replied after a few seconds. "The town is talking about you." Even though she had expected it, Nora still felt her heart skip a beat. "What is it again?" she asked, her voice calmer than her true feelings. "That you and I," Hank paused, trying to choose his words, "that you were trying to curry my favor to get a permanent place. That you were plotting something with June." Nora stood still. The pain was not sharp like an arrow, but a small, repeated cut numbing. "Could it be," she said slowly, "that a woman who is kind to a child can be considered deceitful?" Hank looked at Nora a long time, his eyes full of silent fire. "It's not your fault. It's the fault of the town that talks more than listens, concludes more than understands." But Nora only feels like she's being dragged back to the old days, where she was framed, misunderstood, and even humiliated with fabrications. She clenched her fists. "They've been talking since morning, just over an hour," Hank replied. "The news spread like wildfire. I heard 3 people talking as soon as I left the blacksmith shop." Nora nodded slightly, forcing a faint smile. "Maybe I should leave." Hank jumped up. No, his voice was so strong that Nora jumped. Hank took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "I'm sorry, but no, you're not going anywhere." Nora bowed her head, her voice low. "I don't want to be an excuse for people to look down on you or June." Hank took a step toward her. "Nora, if I feared what people would say, I wouldn't have lived in this neighborhood 10 years ago." Nora knew what he said was true. The man before her was the type to stand still in a strong wind. But she had lived her whole life being pushed by the wind. Standing still was really hard. Hank had to go into town to meet the hay delivery man at noon. He intended to leave Nora at home, but she asked to come along, wanting to see if she could handle it. Hank looked at her for a long time and then nodded slightly. "If you want, I'll walk beside you." They rode the old wagon into Dry Creek. The road leading into the little town was always red, dusty, and smelled of pine from the hills. But today, Nora felt as if everyone was looking at her. No one spoke as they passed, but the silence was piercing. When Hank stopped in front of the blacksmith shop, he turned to Nora. "I'm going to go for a bit. Would you like to go to the grocery store and buy some sugar? I'll meet you there." Nora nodded, though her heart felt like it was on fire. She entered the grocery store of Mr. Emery, a man of curious but not malicious nature. When he saw Nora, Mr. Emery was startled. Then he nodded a little hesitantly. "Hello, Miss Whitmore. Nice day today." Nora replied softly, Beautiful." She walked to the counter. But before she could pick up the bag of sugar, a woman's voice behind her rang out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh, look who it is. Miss Whitmore, the woman who lives in Hank Mercer's house." Nora turned back. Martha Briggs was standing by the flower shelf, her thin lips curved in an unfriendly smile. "That was fast," Martha said, her voice deliberately soft but sharp as a thorn. "In just a few weeks you made a widower look like he had changed his life." Nora took a deep breath. "I don't want to cause trouble, Martha." Martha shrugged. "Oh no, I'm not causing trouble. Just worried about Hank. Worried that someone is taking advantage of him." The insult was so direct that Nora stood up straighter but kept her voice calm. "I don't take advantage of anyone." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Then why were you standing on the porch with Hank last night? You two are very close, huh?" Nora was stunned. So Martha had been eavesdropping. But before Nora could speak, another voice rang out from the doorway. "Enough." His voice was deep, clear, and full of power. Hank stood there, his eyes cold as forged steel. Martha was a little startled. "You've said enough," Hank interrupted. "And you're wrong." Martha squeezed the basket in her hand. "I just want to protect you. I don't need protection from baseless rumors," Hank replied, "especially from someone who came onto my property last night." Martha turned pale. You saw me." Hank's expression remained unchanged. "I've seen enough to know that you have no right to judge others." The whole shop was silent. Nora stood there, surprised and worried. She had expected Hank to defend her, but never expected him to raise his voice like this. Martha pursed her lips, her face turning red with anger. "Mr. Mercer, if you intend to protect her, then I'm not protecting anyone," Hank replied firmly. "I'm just telling the truth. Miss Whitmore is a good person. Silver Branch Ranch has been much better since she arrived." Nora felt her legs lose their support. Hank continued, "If Miss Briggs continues to spread rumors, I will take care of it by town law, not by words." Martha was speechless, picked up her basket, and turned to leave. But before she walked out the door, she turned back to look at Nora with eyes full of hatred. "You will regret it, Whitmore. Trust me." Then she left the shop, her shoes clicking angrily on the wooden floor. After Martha left, Hank approached Nora. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Nora nodded, but her eyes were a little red. "Why did you do that? You will be talked about more because of me." Hank took a deep breath, seemingly holding back his emotions, so as not to say too much. "Nora, if I don't stand up, then what am I living in this town for?" Nora bowed her head. "I'm afraid of becoming the reason you're shunned." Hank slowly lifted Nora's chin, forcing her to look him in the eye. "Nora Whitmore, you're not the reason anyone avoids me. Good people will understand. Bad people will show their true colors sooner or later." Nora trembled slightly, not from fear but because for the first time she saw Hank strong in a way that protected her heart, not just her body or her honor. Returning to the ranch, Nora walked more quietly than usual. But in her heart there were two parallel emotions. One is the familiar fear, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being pushed out of this peaceful life. Two is a new light. The light that comes from Hank's words, from the way he stands straight like a row of pines before a storm. And as it grew dark, Nora knew one thing: Martha Briggs is just getting started. And the coming storm will force Nora to choose: face it or leave it. The late afternoon wind blew through the wooden roof, bringing with it a chill that signaled a long night. Since returning from Dry Creek, Nora had been quiet. Not angry, not sad. Just a kind of wind-blown reflection between old fears and new, unnamed desires. Hank watched her from afar, sensing something was changing. But he didn't push. He gave Nora space, something they both needed. June, unlike the adults, was as innocent as the sun. She ran around the front yard, hugging the new wooden doll that Mr. Bill had given her. The sky was lightly sunny, but the wind was unusually cold, as if the landscape was holding its breath before an important event. That evening, after a quiet meal, Nora cleared the table and washed the dishes as usual. But her hands were slow, her eyes downcast. Hank stood in the doorway watching the scene, his heart clenched. As Nora dried the last plate, he said softly, "Nora, I know today has tired you." Nora replied softly, not looking at him, "I can take it, Hank. The rumor isn't the first time. But I don't want you to suffer alone." Nora stopped but didn't turn around. Hank, you're a good man. But good men have their limits. I'm afraid I'm your limit. Hank moved closer, his voice low. You're not my limit. Nora turned, her eyes glittering with struggle. I was afraid you would get hurt because of me. Hank shook his head. If I get hurt because of protecting you, I still choose to do so. Nora crouched down. Her heart ached, half with pain, half with tears. But instead of letting those feelings surface, she swallowed them. She didn't think she deserved such beautiful protection, not when her past still stands there like a shadow. Night fell. It was getting colder than expected. The wind began to blow, stirring dust to the ground. Nora closed her window, lit a small oil lamp, and sat on the edge of her bed. The golden light reflected off her hands, hands that had trembled with tears after a night of false accusations in the old town she once thought was home. I can't let that happen again here, Nora said to herself, her voice so low that only the wooden walls could hear. She looked toward June's room. Just thinking about that small face with the bright eyes made Nora's chest tighten. But because she loved June, she felt even more like a danger to them both. If I were here, they would talk more. And Hank would have to fight the whole town. June would get in trouble at school. I don't want them to get hurt because of me. Nora stood up, a decision formed painful but sure as the hardwood beneath her feet. She took a small cloth bag from under the bed. It didn't contain much, just a few clothes, a notebook, and a scarf. Then she quietly turned off the light and walked out of the room. In the living room, the stove was still glowing. Hank had gone to bed early after a long, stressful day, but Nora knew he was a light sleeper. He always woke at the sound of a loud noise, so she walked slowly, each step as light as a breath. As she walked past the wooden table, moonlight streamed through the window and fell on June's drawing of Nora standing next to her under an orange sun. Nora closed her eyes, pain like someone was twisting her chest. She'll be fine. She's strong, she whispered, but knew it was a lie to soothe her own heart. Nora turned the front doorknob slowly. The door opened. A strong wind blew in, blowing a few strands of Nora's hair. She pulled her scarf up around her neck, stepped out into the yard, and closed the door behind her. Then she left. But no one in the house knew that June's little footsteps were also coming down the stairs. The child woke up in the middle of the night, feeling the porch shake slightly. When she went to look for Nora, she found her grandmother's door open. The bed was empty. The baby ran out onto the porch. "Miss Nora," the small voice carried on the wind. No reply. June opened the door, looking towards the figure leaving the ranch. "Miss Nora," she cried, fear rising in her. Nora turned back immediately, and her heart stopped. "June, what are you doing here? It's cold." Nora ran over and knelt down to hug her. "Where are you going? Are you not staying with me anymore?" June's voice trembled. Nora squeezed her tightly, her eyes stinging. I'll just go for a bit. But children hear the truth quicker than adults." June cried, hugging Nora's neck as if afraid she would disappear. "Don't leave me, Miss Nora. I'm scared." Her sobs were like knives. Nora shivered. "Darling, I don't want to leave you. But I'm here, they say, and I don't want to upset you." June pulled back, tears rolling down her face. "But I'll be sad if you go." The words stabbed Nora straight in the heart. I need you," June whispered. Just then, the door behind him slammed open. Hank stepped out onto the porch with his coat on his face, tense from hearing June cry. He saw the scene before him, Nora kneeling beside his daughter, still clutching the cloth bag. Hank stood still. Then he said, his voice hoarse with uncontrollable pain, "Nora, are you planning to leave Cedar Bluff?" That question, though light, still struck the porch like lightning. Nora stood up, her heart pounding. I think it's best for you and June." The best way. Hank stepped closer, trying to control his emotions, but his voice still trembled slightly. "The best way would be for you to abandon us. In the middle of a storm of rumors." Nora bit her lip. "I don't want to be a burden." Hank took Nora's shoulder lightly, not hard but enough to make her look at him. "Nora Whitmore, did you ever ask me if I wanted you to go?" "Hank, people are talking about you," Nora replied breathlessly. "I don't want you to get hurt. "And I don't want you gone," Hank said, his voice low and strong as an oath. "I've lost enough. I won't lose more." Nora took a half step back, not out of fear, but because her heart was pounding too hard. Hank continued each word, the deepest truth in him. "Cedar Bluff is quieter since you arrived. My house is warmer. June laughs more. And I feel alive again." "Don't you see?" Nora choked. "But the rumors gossip feeds no one," Hank replied. "You're feeding our hearts." The wind whipped through the yard. June stood between them, tears still streaming down her cheeks. She took Nora's hand, then Hank's, pulling their hands together. "Don't let me lose you." Nora looked at the small hand, then at Hank. In that brief moment, all fears, all painful memories, all rumors, retreated like snow swept away by the wind. Nora sighed, trembling slightly. I can't promise anything long-term, but I'm not ready to leave." Hank closed his eyes for a second as if a weight had been lifted from his chest, then opened them and looked at Nora with a look that had long since warmed. "Then stay. We face it together." Nora nodded, really nodding for the first time. The wind blew again. But this time it wasn't as cold as before. That morning Cedar Bluff Ranch was bathed in a different light. Not the usual harsh yellow, nor the cold silver. Rather, it was a soft, expansive light spreading like a breath of fresh air, covering every blade of grass, every grain of wood on the porch, like a light reserved for those who have just weathered a storm inside. Nora stood on the porch, her hands still shaking as she tied her hair, but her eyes were no longer as foggy as the night before. All morning she had thought she could hear June crying as she ran onto the porch, and it made her heart sink every time she remembered. But underneath it all there was something even more powerful. Nora didn't leave. For the first time in her life, her decision wasn't one of fear, but of choice. June ran around the yard, her clear laughter mingling with the gentle wind. When she saw Nora, she ran to hug her grandmother's leg and whispered, "You're not going anymore, are you, Nora?" Bent down and stroked her hair. "No, honey, I'm here." June held Nora's waist tightly, as if afraid she would change her mind. Nora looked down at her, and a warmth filled her, a warmth no other place had ever brought before. Hank stepped out onto the porch after finishing the stables. He looked at the two people before him, a woman standing there, the morning light filtering through her hair, and a child holding her as if the world revolved around that moment. His eyes softened, but his voice held its familiar calm. "Nora, I want to talk to you, if you have time." Nora nodded slightly. "Of course." Hank motioned for him to follow him down to the end of the yard, where the old pines sheltered from the wind. June ran up the small hill behind the house, playing with her wooden doll. The early morning wind blew on them light as a silk scarf. Hank stood facing Nora, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture as sturdy as a large tree trunk. "Last night," he began, "I thought more than I said. Scared, angry, but also glad you stayed." Nora looked down at her shoes. "I don't want to go, Hank. I'm just afraid of making you fight for me." Hank let out a long, heartfelt sigh. "I've fought for nothing all my life. But if it's for you, for June, for the peace in this house, it's not a fight, it's a choice." Nora looked up and met his quiet blue eyes. "But you have lost so much already. I fear I am a burden." Hank shook his head immediately. "No, Nora. You're not a burden. You're the reason we're lighter." A thin wind swept by. Nora hugged her scarf close to her neck. Her voice trembled slightly. "But I'm not used to being loved in such a safe way." "Let me teach you," Hank said, his voice low, warm, unhurried. "No pressure, no compulsion. Just here, with you." Nora's heart clenched as she listened, not painfully but choked with emotion. Nora helped Hank work in the stables all morning. There was little talk, just steady footsteps and the sound of dry wood on wood. Hank watched Nora as she smiled softly, as she stroked the head of the old brown horse, or frowned at a straw caught in her skirt. He felt what he thought he had lost for years, the desire to stand beside someone his heart trusted. At lunch, they ate in a comfortable silence. June kept telling stories about the desert mice she thought she saw that morning. Hank nodded, and Nora laughed softly, a small laugh like a stream. When she smiled, Hank looked longer than usual. And Nora noticed. But she didn't avoid the gaze anymore. In the afternoon, Reverend Alton, the town minister, rided into the ranch. Nora was hanging blankets and saw him from a distance. She stopped, her face pale. Martha Briggs's words from the day before came back to her. Hank stepped out onto the porch, his eyes immediately narrowing. The Reverend dismounted, adjusted his collar, and said in a stern voice, "I hear there's some bad news going around town. And some people are worried Hank is being swayed by a woman with a shady past." Nora bowed her head as if she had been splashed with cold water. But Hank took a step forward, standing slightly in front of her. Reverend Hank said, his voice low but firm, "If you came here to say mean things to my family, I apologize. But this door is not open for that." Reverend frowned. "Hank, you should be careful." "Public opinion. The public doesn't raise my child," Hank said simply. "Nora takes care of June, works, lives a decent life. She deserves respect." The Reverend looked at Nora, his eyes searching. "How long do you intend to stay here, Miss Whitmore?" Nora wanted to reply, "I'm not sure," but Hank spoke first, "as long as she wants." Reverend was slightly startled. So was Nora. "Hank, you said that in front of the pastor," Nora whispered, eyes wide. Hank turned to Nora, and for the first time he didn't beat around the bush, didn't keep his thoughts to himself. "Nora, I don't care what anyone thinks. I only care about what I know. You brighten up this house. You remind me that I can still love. And June thinks of you as family." Nora choked. Reverend Alton, after a moment of silence, sighed. "Well then, I hope this is for the best. For all three of you." He bowed and left, leaving a light dust trailing behind his horse. Nora looked at Hank, her eyes were wet but not tearful. "Hank, why did you—" Hank smiled very slightly. "Because I chose you, Nora. I chose you before public opinion, before the words of others. I chose you because I wanted you here." Nora put her hand to her chest where her heart was beating irregularly. Late in the afternoon, June asked Nora to brush her hair before going to sleep. Nora took the wooden comb Hank had given her and sat next to her. Every movement was slow, gentle, and full of love. June smiled, leaned her head into Nora's lap, and said softly, "I want you here forever." Nora kissed her hair, her heart as soft as water after a storm. "Baby, I want that too." At night, when June was asleep, the wind died down, and only the sound of crickets chirping in the field could be heard. Nora stood on the porch looking east, where the horizon had a faint glow like the light of distant but approaching hopes. Hank stepped out and stood beside her. No words, no need to speak. A moment later, Nora spoke, her voice low but light as the wind. "Hank, if my story causes the town to stir again, will you regret siding with me?" Hank tilted his head to look at her, his gaze as steady as rock. "Nora Whitmore," he said slowly, "since my wife died, I have not made a choice with my heart. But you make me want to choose again." Nora felt her throat tighten, but she still asked, "And if I say I want to stay, are you sure you won't change your mind?" Hank placed one hand on the railing, the other resting lightly on the back of Nora's hand. "I am as sure as the sun rises in the east every morning." Nora chuckled softly, a thin tear falling, not a tear of pain but the tear of someone who finally found herself completely seen. "So, I stay," said Nora. "Not because I'm not afraid," she continued, "but because I want to believe what you believe." Hank nodded, his eyes full of emotion but still simple like the nature of the West. "We walk together, starting today." Far away in the east, a streak of golden light was expanding under the setting sun, and on the porch of Cedar Bluff Ranch, three hearts, a man, a woman, a child, are starting a new life, imperfect, unassuming, but as real and warm as the West itself. Nora Whitmore's story reminds us of something very true. At any age, we can still be loved again. We can still recover from old hurts, and we can still find a home not in bricks and mortar but in kindness and forgiveness. Many of us, especially in our later years, have experienced enough loss to understand that being gentle does not mean being weak. Silence does not mean being submissive. Sometimes, silence is the strongest way to affirm our value in a noisy world. If there is anything to hold on to for tomorrow, it is the belief that each of us deserves a place to stay in the hearts of others and in our own lives. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you feel warm or find a little of yourself in it, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying us on the next humane journeys. Your presence is what helps us continue to tell these kind stories.